This is Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong. Tidbits of Texas history you never learned in school. Today's episode, Juneteenth. What you know for sure that ain't so. There's a category of knowledge known as what you know for sure that ain't so. Believing Juneteenth, 1865, was the actual date of the emancipation of America's slaves is an example. Instead, the reality of emancipation is more complex. It was, in fact, a process over time instead of one single event. Let's start with what Juneteenth actually was. After the South's Civil War surrender in April of 1865, Texas was without central government for 2 months. Isolated by the lack of timely communication, due in part to sparse telegraph connections and by the difficulties of travel without interstate stage service or railroad connections, Texans had received very little news about events following the end of the Civil War hostilities. Texas's population of slaves was most likely the least informed. In May, the month following the surrender, General Sheridan was appointed commander of the Military Division of the Southwest, based in New Orleans. He sent Major General Gordon Granger to Texas with 1,800 troops. Granger was tasked with creating and overseeing a Reconstruction government in the state, as outlined by President Andrew Johnson in his proclamation, The Restoration of Civil Government for Texas, issued on June 17th. General Granger arrived in Galveston on the 19th of June, 1865. Immediately upon landing, Granger proclaimed to Texans that all slaves were free. In effect, he was simply communicating something that had already been declared by President Lincoln, news of which may not have been widely known in the state. He also provided some initial guidelines. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. Now, this leaves us with a question. If America's slaves were already freed before Juneteenth, when were they freed? Remember, I said emancipation was a process. So let's start at the beginning. One thing that had to change before slaves would be freed was President Lincoln's policy regarding slavery, which he commented on before the war. In a speech in Peoria, Illinois, he said, quote, "There can be no moral right in connection with one man making a slave of another," end quote. However, he also believed that the Constitution did not give the government the power to abolish slavery where it existed, only to prevent slavery's spread to new states and territories. The Militia Act of 1862, passed by Congress in July, provided for black men to serve in the Union Army. Passed at the same time, the Confiscation Act provided for slaves taken from supporters of the Confederacy to be declared forever free. On September 22nd of the same year, Lincoln released a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that enslaved people in the rebellious Confederate States would, as of the following January, be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Sure enough, 100 days later, on January 1st, 1863, almost 3 years after the start of the war, President Abraham Lincoln issued a formal Emancipation Proclamation. However, rather than freeing all slaves, this document only freed enslaved people in the 11 Confederate states which had seceded from the Union. It did not free slaves in the border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia, which incidentally became a state 6 months after Emancipation Proclamation. Nor did the Emancipation Proclamation free any slaves in the 24 states which made up the Union. It's also interesting to note that the document excluded slaves in the areas in the Confederacy which were under Union control. All this, of course, was dependent upon an ultimate Union victory. However, the document did reinforce the acceptance of black men into the United States military. Subsequently, an estimated 200,000 blacks served during the war as soldiers and sailors. Although Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, the official end of the Civil War was not declared by the new president, Andrew Johnson, until August 20, 1866. Between those two dates, all U.S. slavery was officially abolished by the adoption of the 13th Amendment, which freed more than 100,000 enslaved people across the country. In short, black bondage in the United States was finally ended on December 6, 1865. Emancipation was a long time coming, from the initial steps in 1862 to final fruition with the 13th Amendment freeing America's slaves at the end of 1865. However, it's true that black slaves held by the nations of the 5 civilized tribes in official Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma, mostly remained as slaves until the Treaty of 1866, which finally freed them. General Granger's announcement in Texas on Juneteenth was certainly cause for celebration back then by Texas slaves, and both then and now by anyone who values freedom. Although Granger informed Texans that slaves had been freed by proclamation of the President, this freedom was not fully completed nor verified until December 6, 1865, by the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Which date should the nation celebrate as the date of the emancipation of slaves? Probably not Juneteenth, but take your pick. Choose whatever emancipation date or dates you wish as a special time to celebrate the right to freedom for one and all. This has been Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong, the best little podcast in Texas. Be sure to check out my historical novel, Gone to Dallas, the Storekeeper, 1856 to 1861. Find it on Amazon, Goodreads, and other bookish sites. Watch for my new novel, The Queen of Cotton, Confederate Camel Caravan Across Texas, coming later this year. Thanks for listening. Y'all come back.